Hey guys, tonight we begin with something cozy. Not cozy in a warm cinnamon bread way. More like damp brick, thin soup, and existential fatigue cozy. The kind of cozy where you're wrapped in a blanket, lights dimmed, maybe rain tapping the window, and we quietly wander through the streets of 1800s New York to see what people were actually eating. So go ahead and settle in, loosen your shoulders, let your breathing slow down. We're not here for drama. We're here for porridge. Possibly very questionable porridge. Tonight, we're drifting into 19th century New York, specifically the neighborhoods where the rent was low, the air quality was terrible, and dinner was negotiable. When we picture 1800s New York, we tend to imagine elegant brownstones, horse-drawn carriages, and wealthy families dining on roast beef under chandeliers. And yes, those people existed. But they were vastly outnumbered by dock workers, factory girls, laundresses, street vendors, and newly arrived immigrants who were mostly just trying to eat something that wouldn't actively betray them. Let's float down toward Lower Manhattan, the Five Points neighborhood, arguably one of the most crowded and infamous districts in 19th century America. The kind of place where you could rent a corner of a room that already had 4 other families in it, because privacy is overrated. By the early 1800s, New York was growing at a speed that would make modern urban planners quietly panic. Waves of immigrants arrived, especially from Ireland and Germany, and later from Italy and Eastern Europe. They came for opportunity. They got tenements and very creative cooking. Food for the poor was about 3 things: cost, availability, and how long it could survive without refrigeration. And since refrigeration did not exist in the modern sense, survival was key. If it didn't last, it rotted. If it rotted, you either threw it out or didn't, depending on your options. Bread was the foundation. Always bread. But not the fluffy, artisanal, sourdough with the name bread. We're talking dense loaves made from cheaper flour. Sometimes rye, sometimes mixed with cornmeal, sometimes made from flour that had been sitting in storage just a bit too long. If you were lucky, it was fresh. If you were less lucky, you cut off the moldy parts and told yourself it was rustic. Bakeries often sold day-old bread at reduced prices. Poor families would line up near closing time to get whatever hadn't sold. It was filling. It was cheap. And if you soaked it in something, it softened up nicely. That something was often tea, weak tea, or coffee. Even weaker coffee. Coffee in poor neighborhoods was frequently made from reused grounds. Brewed once for someone wealthier, then sold off or reused again. Sometimes stretched with roasted chicory. Sometimes stretched with things that were not chicory. Let's just say food adulteration was practically a sport in 19th century New York. Milk was another staple. But here's where it gets slightly unfortunate. In the mid-1800s, New York had what became known as the swill milk scandal. Cows were kept in distillery basements and fed the leftover mash from alcohol production. The cows became sickly. Their milk became thin, bluish, and not exactly nourishing. To fix the color, producers sometimes added chalk or flour. Because if you're going to sell questionable milk, you might as well make it aesthetically convincing. This milk was then sold cheaply to poor families, especially for infants. It did not go well. But for many families, it was what they could afford. And milk, even bad milk, was seen as essential. So it was purchased, watered down further at home to stretch it. Now let's move to soup, because soup was the great equalizer. Soup kitchens began appearing in New York in the early 19th century. Charitable organizations would distribute large vats of soup to the poor. Usually some combination of bones, barley, potatoes, onions, maybe a bit of cabbage. It was thin, but it was warm. And warmth matters when you're living in a drafty tenement with windows that don't quite close. At home, families made their own versions. If someone had managed to buy a scrap of meat, maybe beef shank, maybe pork bones, they would boil it for hours. Every possible bit of flavor extracted. The same bones might be reused the next day, and maybe the day after that. Potatoes were a hero ingredient. Cheap, filling, forgiving. You could boil them, mash them, slice them into stews, fry them in a bit of saved fat if you were feeling festive. Irish immigrants especially relied heavily on potatoes. Before the Great Famine, potatoes had already been central to Irish diets. After arriving in New York, they continued to be a staple, paired with cabbage when possible. Salted pork if someone had a bit of money that week. Salt pork deserves a moment of appreciation. It was fatty, heavily salted, and preserved well, which meant it could survive in less than ideal conditions. You didn't eat large slabs of it unless you were doing unusually well. Instead, you cut off tiny bits, rendered the fat, used it to flavor everything else. Flavor was stretched the way fabric was stretched, carefully, thinly, with hope. Street food also played a role. Vendors sold oysters on the street, which sounds fancy now. But in the early 1800s, oysters were cheap and abundant in New York Harbor. So cheap that even working-class New Yorkers could afford them. Oyster cellars existed for wealthier patrons, yes, but street oysters were a quick, protein-heavy snack. Of course, by the late 19th century, pollution and over-harvesting made oysters less accessible, so that brief moment of affordable seafood faded. Like so many good things, another common street item was pies. Meat pies, fruit pies, mystery pies. Small, handheld, affordable. Not always freshly baked, but portable. And if you were working long hours in a factory, portability mattered. Factories, by the way, did not provide lunch breaks as we would understand them today. Workers brought food wrapped in cloth, bread, maybe cheese, maybe a cold potato, something that could sit in a pocket without becoming dangerous. Children worked too. Newsboys, factory children, errand runners. Their meals were often irregular. A roll here, an apple there. Maybe a bowl of stew at home if the family pot had something in it. Apples were surprisingly important. They were relatively cheap when in season. They stored decently. And they provided a rare sweetness in an otherwise very starch-heavy diet. Speaking of sweetness, sugar was not abundant for the poor. It existed, of course, but it was precious. Molasses was more common. Thick, dark, slightly bitter molasses. It could be stirred into porridge or spread thinly on bread. Children likely considered it the height of luxury. Porridge itself was a frequent breakfast. Oats, cornmeal, or whatever grain was cheapest. Boiled in water, sometimes with milk, if available. Salted more often than sweetened. It was dependable. It filled the stomach. It required only one pot. And one pot cooking was essential when your kitchen was essentially a stove in the corner of a crowded room. Tenement kitchens were not separate rooms in many cases. Cooking happened where sleeping happened, where washing happened, where life happened, so food smells lingered. Boiled cabbage, fried onions, damp bread. German immigrants brought sausages, sauerkraut, and beer culture. But even those foods were adapted to budgets. Sausages might be stretched with grains. Sauerkraut made in batches and eaten slowly over weeks. Italian immigrants later introduced pasta. But early on, pasta was not yet the cheap supermarket staple we think of today. It was often homemade, labor-intensive, and still a bit of a treat. Let's gently consider meat. Meat was aspirational. For many poor families, meat appeared maybe once or twice a week, often in small amounts. Offal organ meats were cheaper. Liver, kidneys, tripe. These were not fashionable among the wealthy, which made them accessible to those with fewer choices. Tripe stews were common. Long simmered to soften the texture, highly seasoned if seasoning could be afforded. Otherwise just salted and endured. Markets in New York sold leftover cuts at reduced prices toward the end of the day. Families timed their shopping carefully, waiting for discounts, hoping the meat was still safe. Refrigeration again being not a thing. Ice existed, but it was harvested from frozen lakes in winter and stored in ice houses. The wealthy had better access to ice boxes. The poor relied on quick cooking and preservation methods like salting and pickling. Pickled foods were everywhere. Pickled cucumbers, pickled cabbage, pickled anything that could survive vinegar. Pickling extended shelf life and added sharp flavor to otherwise bland meals. Now, let's drift slightly into beverages. Water in 19th century New York was not always clean. The Croton Aqueduct, completed in 1842, significantly improved the city's water supply. Before that, many relied on wells that could be contaminated. So sometimes, oddly enough, weak beer or cider was safer than water. Small beer low alcohol content was consumed by adults and sometimes even children. It was not about getting drunk. It was about hydration that wouldn't immediately cause illness. Tea was popular among Irish immigrants, but again, stretched. One batch of leaves used repeatedly. The third steeping probably tasted like regret. And then there was charity bread. Churches and benevolent societies distributed food. Bread lines became more common in economic downturns. The Panic of 1837, for instance, threw many into unemployment. Food insecurity spiked. Lines grew longer. Soup got thinner. Let's pause here and just imagine a typical day. Morning, a bowl of porridge. Maybe with a spoonful of molasses if the week had gone well. Midday, bread. Perhaps a slice of cheese, or a cold boiled potato. Evening, soup, potatoes again, cabbage, a hint of pork fat. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't varied, but it was survival. Nutritionally, it was heavy on carbohydrates, light on fresh vegetables in winter, low in consistent protein. Vitamin deficiencies were common. Children in particular suffered from malnutrition-related illnesses. And yet, within these constraints, there was creativity. Families guarded recipes. Simple stews passed down. Techniques for stretching dough, for making yesterday's bread edible, for turning bones into broth that felt like comfort rather than scarcity. Because food is not just calories, it's routine. It's stability. It's something warm in your hands after a long shift in a textile mill. The Irish arrived in huge numbers after the Great Famine of the 1840s. Many of them landed in New York with very little money, very little English, and very little patience left for disaster. They clustered in neighborhoods like 5 Points because rent was low. Low, meaning you might share a bed with someone on a different work shift. Efficient, intimate, slightly chaotic. Boarding houses were common. A widow might rent out floor space or bunks to single men working on docks or in construction. Meals were often included in the arrangement, and those meals were predictable. Breakfast was usually oatmeal or cornmeal mush. Oats were familiar, comforting, even. But American oats were not quite the same as back home. Still, boiled grain is boiled grain. Add a pinch of salt. Maybe a drizzle of molasses if someone had splurged. And there you go. Midday meals were often portable. Thick slices of bread, sometimes with butter, sometimes without. If butter was available, it was used carefully. Spread thin enough that you could almost see through it. A poetic whisper of dairy. Cabbage featured heavily. Boiled cabbage. Stewed cabbage. Cabbage cooked with a bit of salt pork. It's amazing how many emotional states cabbage can represent. Hope, resignation, mild digestive regret. Potatoes remain central. But here's the twist. In America, potatoes were plentiful and cheap, but the trauma of the famine lingered. The Irish weren't exactly thrilled to rely entirely on potatoes again. Still, when you're working 12 hours a day digging canals or laying railroad tracks, potatoes are reliable. They fill the stomach. They sit there quietly. They do not ask questions. Salt pork or bacon was added when possible. But meat was still a luxury. So Irish stews in New York were often thinner than their rural Irish counterparts. More broth, fewer chunks. Stretch it, always stretch it. Now let's gently wander over to a German enclave. Maybe the Lower East Side in the 1860s. You'll notice something different almost immediately. There's bread. But it's darker, denser, rye-heavy. German immigrants brought baking traditions with them, and small bakeries began popping up. The smell of fresh rye bread drifting into crowded streets must have felt like a tiny victory. Germans also brought sausages and beer. Now beer halls weren't just places to drink, they were social spaces. Community anchors. You worked all day, you went to the beer hall. Not necessarily to get wildly intoxicated, just to sit, talk, eat something warm. Sausages were often cheaper cuts of meat ground and mixed with spices, sometimes stretched with breadcrumbs or grains. Still, compared to plain boiled potatoes, sausage felt festive. Sauerkraut was another staple. Fermented cabbage keeps well. It's sour, it's sharp. It adds personality to an otherwise mild plate, and personality was important. But here's the gentle reality. Even within these communities, poverty shaped everything. Not every German immigrant was feasting in a cozy beer hall. Many lived in cramped tenements just like everyone else. Sauerkraut might be homemade in a barrel in the corner. Sausages were rationed carefully. Let's ease forward a couple of decades and drift into the late 1800s, when Italian immigrants began arriving in larger numbers. Picture a tiny kitchen. A mother rolling dough on a worn wooden board. Flour dust in the air. Pasta hanging to dry. Except, not quite the romantic version you're imagining. Early Italian immigrants were often extremely poor. Southern Italians especially arrived with little money. Pasta was familiar, yes, but durum wheat wasn't always easy to find at first. So recipes adapted. Doughs were made with what was available. Tomatoes were more common in America than in many parts of Italy at the time, which is ironic. The New World crop returning to feed New World immigrants. Circle of life, but with more simmering sauce. Simple tomato sauces, garlic, onions, maybe a bit of cheese if it could be afforded. Cheese was precious. Hard cheeses lasted longer. Softer cheeses were rare treats. Street vendors sold macaroni. Cheap bowls of pasta topped with a bit of sauce. Filling, affordable, portable-ish. Italian families also relied heavily on bread. Dipped in olive oil if available. Though olive oil wasn't yet the supermarket staple it is today. Sometimes lard stood in. Because lard was cheaper. And calories are calories. Now let's float into the markets. Open-air markets were chaotic but essential. Pushcarts lined the streets. Vendors shouting in different languages. Vegetables displayed in small piles. Onions, turnips, carrots, cabbage again, because cabbage never truly leaves us. Seasonality mattered deeply. In summer, there were more fresh vegetables. In winter, options shrank dramatically. Root vegetables stored well, so winter diets became heavier. More starch, fewer fresh greens. Fish was available, especially for those near the docks. But again, freshness was unpredictable. Salted fish was more reliable. Cod, especially salted cod, was a staple across many communities. It lasted, it traveled. It survived neglect. Preparation involved soaking to remove excess salt. Then boiling, maybe adding it to stews. It was protein, even if it tasted faintly of the Atlantic in persistence. Let's slow down and consider children again. Many poor children were underfed. Meals were irregular. Growth was stunted. Rickets and other deficiency diseases were common. Milk, when available, was often unsafe. Vegetables were limited in winter. Charitable organizations sometimes focused specifically on feeding children. Bread and milk programs, though again, the milk situation was complicated. Some reformers pushed for better regulation of food quality. The swill milk scandal we mentioned earlier eventually led to public outrage. Newspapers exposed the conditions. Slowly, reforms followed. Not immediately, not dramatically. But eventually, meanwhile, daily life continued. Women often managed food budgets, which meant constant calculation. How much flour left? How long can this cabbage last? If we skip meat this week, can we afford coal for heating? Coal, by the way, was another expense competing with food. In winter, families sometimes had to choose between warmth and slightly better meals. Neither option was ideal. Leftovers were sacred, nothing wasted, bones saved. Vegetable scraps added to broths, bread crusts dried and reused in puddings. Ah yes, bread pudding, a gentle attempt to resurrect stale bread. Soaked in milk, maybe sweetened slightly. Baked if there was access to an oven, otherwise steamed or cooked in creative ways. It was humble, but it felt like dessert. Dessert itself was rare. Holidays were exceptions. Christmas, for example, might bring slightly better fare. Perhaps a chicken if the family had saved for months. Maybe a special cake. Spices were expensive, so spiced cakes were treasured. Community celebration sometimes meant pooling resources. Shared meals, shared dishes. A brief moment where the food was less about survival and more about identity. Now let's gently glide into boarding house dinners more closely. Imagine a long wooden table, 10 men sitting shoulder to shoulder. Bowls passed down. Conversation low and tired. The landlady serves stew, it's mostly broth. A few visible chunks of potato. Maybe a sliver of meat floating like a rare artifact. No one complains loudly. Because lodging depends on goodwill, and everyone understands the math. You eat slowly. Stretch it. Bread dipped into broth to absorb every drop. A second ladle if there's enough. Often there isn't. After dinner, maybe tea. Thin. Pale. Still warm. And then sleep. In shifts sometimes. Beds shared by workers on alternating schedules. The mattress never fully cools. Food and labor were intertwined. Dock workers needed calories, factory workers too, but wages were low. So calories were often insufficient. Malnutrition didn't always look dramatic. It looked like constant fatigue, frequent illness. Children smaller than expected, yet within all this, culture survived. German bakeries, Irish pubs, Italian pasta shops. Jewish delis emerging toward the late 19th century. Each community adapting recipes to American ingredients and American poverty. Pickles became important in Jewish immigrant diets. Pickled cucumbers sold from barrels, cheap, flavorful, tangy. A bright note in a gray diet. Bagels were not yet the mainstream breakfast icon. They were regional, handmade, boiled and baked. Sold cheaply within neighborhoods. Dense, filling. Herring, often pickled, was another staple among Eastern European Jewish immigrants. It was affordable protein, salty, strong. Acquired taste perhaps, but effective. Let's pause again and just breathe in the imagined smells. Boiled cabbage, yeast bread, vinegar, coal smoke, salt fish, onion. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't Instagrammable. It was survival cuisine. And yet, from these cramped kitchens and crowded markets, the foundation of New York's food culture was being quietly built. Every adaptation, every substitution, every watered-down stew. By the mid-1800s, New York City was expanding at a speed that made oversight nearly impossible. Ships unloaded food daily. Wagons rolled in from upstate farms. Warehouses filled. And in between all of that movement were middlemen, many honest, some less so, and a few who looked at a barrel of flour and thought, you know what this needs? A little something extra. Let's begin with flour. Flour was essential. Bread, porridge, dumplings, cheap pies. Poor families depended on it, but good flour cost money. So lower quality flour was often sold at discount prices. Sometimes it had simply aged poorly. Sometimes it had absorbed moisture and turned slightly musty. And sometimes it had been extended. Extension is such a polite word. Chalk, ground bone, plaster of Paris, even finely milled sawdust were occasionally added to flour to bulk it up. Not in massive proportions, necessarily. Just enough to stretch a shipment and increase profit. A light dusting of entrepreneurial optimism. The problem, of course, was that poor families were the ones buying the cheapest flour. which meant they were most likely to consume the most creative blends. Bread made from adulterated flour could be oddly pale, or oddly dense, or crumble in a way that suggested something wasn't quite right. But when you're hungry and funds are low, you slice it, toast it if you can, and move on with your day. Milk, as we gently mentioned before, had its own reputation. The infamous swill milk situation peaked in the 1850s. Cows kept in urban distilleries were fed leftover mash from alcohol production. The animals were often unhealthy, their milk thin and bluish. To make it more marketable, sellers added chalk for color, molasses for sweetness, and sometimes flour to thicken it. Because apparently, if something looks more like milk, that's close enough. Infant mortality rates were high. And while disease and sanitation were major factors, contaminated milk did not help. Public outrage eventually built. Journalists exposed the practice. Reformers demanded regulation. And slowly, painfully slowly, standards improved. But for decades, poor families navigated a marketplace where fresh was a flexible concept. Now let's drift into coffee. Coffee was beloved, especially among laborers. A warm cup before dawn. A brief comfort before heading into factories or onto docks. But coffee beans were expensive. So roasted chicory root became a common substitute or additive. Chicory isn't dangerous. It's just not coffee. But it deepens color and stretches supply. Less harmless additives included roasted peas, burned bread crusts, or random plant material ground into powder. The result was a beverage that smelled promising but delivered mild disappointment. Tea had similar issues. Used tea leaves were sometimes dried and resold. Artificial coloring was added to make them look fresher. The third steeping at home might taste faintly of dust and resilience. Spices were another playground for adulteration. Pepper could be mixed with ground seeds. Cinnamon might contain fillers. Mustard powder sometimes included turmeric or flour. Because spices were sold ground, it was easy to disguise creative additions. Candy was particularly theatrical. Brightly colored sweets were popular with children, especially penny candy. Cheap, sugary, sold in jars from general stores. To achieve vibrant colors, some manufacturers used chemical dyes containing arsenic or copper compounds. The colors were dazzling, the long-term health effects less so, but again, we're not here for drama. Just quiet acknowledgement that the 1800s were a regulatory learning curve. Let's move gently toward meat. Urban meat markets were busy places, but refrigeration was limited. Iceboxes existed mainly in wealthier homes and businesses, so meat had to move quickly. If it didn't, it was sometimes refreshed, salt rubbed on surfaces, cuts trimmed. Sausages heavily spiced to mask questionable origins. Because once meat is ground and mixed, it becomes harder to identify its previous life choices. Offal was cheaper and sold quickly. Liver, kidneys, tripe. These didn't sit around long because demand was steady among poorer families. Fish had similar challenges. Fresh fish spoiled rapidly. So salted fish became essential. Cod especially. It traveled well and lasted. But soaking salted cod required time and clean water, two resources not always abundant. Markets were noisy, chaotic, layered with smells. Vendors shouting prices. Housewives examining produce carefully. Bargaining was common. Suspicion was healthy. Still, most vendors were not villains. Many were immigrants themselves, barely scraping by. The system encouraged cutting corners. And when profit margins are thin, ethics can become flexible. Now let's drift back into tenement kitchens. Imagine a woman slicing onions. The room dimly lit. A pot simmering on a small coal stove. She bought flour earlier that day. It was cheap. She suspects it's not the best quality. But it was what she could afford. She needs dough, bakes bread. The loaf is slightly heavier than usual, the crust pale. But it will do. Children hover nearby. One coughs. Another complains of hunger. She cuts thick slices, hands them out. No one comments on texture. This is daily life. Food safety laws, as we understand them today, were almost non-existent in early 19th century America. It wasn't until later reforms, particularly toward the end of the century, that stronger regulations began emerging. The Pure Food and Drug Act would not appear until 1906, long after decades of questionable bread had already been consumed. In the meantime, knowledge spread informally, word of mouth. Don't buy from that stall. His milk smells strange. Community shared warnings. Charitable groups sometimes distributed food they prepared themselves to ensure quality. Soup kitchens became not just places of relief, but places of slightly safer meals. Let's float briefly to oysters again. In the early 1800s, oysters were abundant in New York Harbor. They were so common that even working-class New Yorkers ate them regularly. Raw, fried, stewed in oyster pies. But as industrial pollution increased and harbor waters became more contaminated, oyster quality declined, which is a very gentle way of saying they became less advisable. Still, oysters remained part of street food culture for decades. Sold from carts. Served quickly. A squeeze of lemon if you were lucky. Street vendors also sold roasted chestnuts in winter. Warm, affordable, comforting, not adulterated, just simple. Sometimes simplicity was safer. Now let's consider alcohol. Cheap liquor was widely available, often stronger than expected, sometimes diluted, sometimes not diluted enough. Saloons dotted poor neighborhoods. For some, alcohol was a brief escape from exhausting labor and limited meals. Beer, especially among German communities, was often safer than water. Brewed locally, lower alcohol content. Consumed socially. Temperance movements gained traction in the mid-1800s. Reformers argued that alcohol drained wages and harmed families, which sometimes it did. But for many laborers, a drink was one of the few accessible comforts. Food and drink weren't just sustenance. They were coping mechanisms. Let's gently zoom out. By the late 19th century, reform movements gained momentum. Journalists began exposing unsanitary conditions in food production. Public awareness grew. Organizations pushed for inspections. Clean water initiatives improved with infrastructure projects like the Croton Aqueduct. Slowly, standards rose, but change was uneven and slow. Meanwhile, the daily rhythm continued. Morning porridge, bread at midday, soup at night, sometimes flavored with honest ingredients, sometimes with creative substitutions. And yet, this is important, the majority of meals were not maliciously dangerous. They were simply cheap, limited, repetitive. The real hardship wasn't dramatic poisoning scandals. It was monotony, nutritional gaps, chronic undernourishment. Vitamin deficiencies like scurvy or rickets appeared not because people were eating chalk bread every day, but because fresh produce was seasonal and expensive. Winter was hardest. Fewer vegetables, less sunlight, heavy reliance on stored grains and salted meat. But spring brought markets back to life, fresh greens, new potatoes, slight optimism. In 1800s New York, seasons dictated everything. There were no refrigerated trucks, no strawberries in January, no imported citrus casually stacked in winter markets for everyone to enjoy. If you wanted something out of season, you either preserved it months ago, or you simply didn't have it. Winter was the hardest stretch for poor families. By late November, fresh produce was already dwindling. Root vegetables stored well: potatoes, turnips, carrots. Cabbage could last surprisingly long in cool cellars. Onions too. But leafy greens? Fragile, gone. So winter meals became heavier, thicker, browner. Breakfast was still porridge. Oatmeal if you could afford oats. Cornmeal mush if cornmeal was cheaper. Always boiled, always filling. Occasionally improved with a small spoon of molasses, which felt almost luxurious in the cold months. Molasses had calories, dense, dark sweetness. And calories were warmth. Dinner often meant stews that leaned heavily on whatever had been salted, dried, or pickled earlier in the year. Salt pork, carefully rationed. Salted beef if someone had done especially well during autumn wages. Dried beans soaked overnight to soften them. Beans were winter heroes, cheap, filling, protein-rich. Picture a pot of bean stew simmering for hours on a small coal stove, the lid rattling slightly. The smell steady and plain. A child hovering nearby, not impatient exactly, but hopeful. Coal itself was an expense that competed directly with food. Families bought coal by the bucket. If wages were short, they burned less, which meant the kitchen was colder, which meant cooking took longer, which meant meals were sometimes eaten lukewarm. And lukewarm stew in January is not ideal. Let's imagine a tenement apartment. Brick walls sweating with condensation. A single stove in the corner. Laundry hanging to dry above it. The air thick with humidity and coal smoke. Dinner is cabbage again, because cabbage keeps. Cabbage boiled with a scrap of salt pork. The pork isn't meant to be eaten in large pieces. It's there to whisper flavor into the water. Once the cabbage is soft, bowls are filled, bread is dipped. Everyone eats quietly. Vitamin deficiencies were more visible in winter. Without fresh fruits or greens, scurvy sometimes appeared, especially among those who couldn't afford even occasional citrus. Rickets, caused by vitamin D deficiency, was common in children who spent long hours indoors in cramped, dim apartments. And yet, winter also brought small comforts. Roasted chestnuts from street vendors. Warm in paper cones, cheap enough for a small indulgence. The smell of chestnuts drifting through icy streets was one of the few truly cheerful scents of the season. Bakeries became especially important in winter. Fresh bread meant warmth. Even stepping into a bakery for a moment could thaw cold fingers. Poor families often bought bread daily rather than baking at home, because heating an oven required fuel they might not have. Now let's gently turn the calendar forward. Summer arrives. And with it, heat. Tenements were not designed for airflow. Windows opened onto narrow alleys. Rooms trapped humidity. The same brick walls that held winter cold now held summer heat. Cooking in summer was a different kind of challenge. Heavy stews were less appealing. And food spoiled quickly. Milk turned sour fast in July. Meat had to be cooked almost immediately after purchase. Ice was more available in summer, harvested from winter lakes and stored in insulated ice houses than delivered by ice wagons. But regular ice delivery cost money. Wealthier households had ice boxes. Poor families might buy small chunks of ice occasionally, but it wasn't guaranteed. So meals shifted slightly. Fresh vegetables were more abundant. Markets were lively: tomatoes, corn, greens, beans. Summer produce offered brief nutritional relief. Salads were simple sliced tomatoes, onions, maybe dressed lightly with vinegar. Corn became a common summer food. Boiled corn, cornmeal dishes, cheap and filling. Fruit appeared in pushcarts. Apples, yes, but also peaches when in season. Berries, sometimes overripe, sold at discount prices. Children might get a small handful as a treat. Street food thrived in summer. Vendors selling watermelon slices. Lemonade stands offering watered-down refreshment. Because even a diluted lemonade felt like a celebration when the heat was relentless. But summer had its dangers too. Foodborne illness spiked. Without refrigeration, bacteria multiplied quickly. Diarrheal diseases were common, especially among children. Milk spoiled within hours. Families sometimes boiled milk to extend its life, but fuel costs made constant boiling impractical. Flies were everywhere, landing on meat, on fruit, on everything. And yet, summer also meant longer daylight. Outdoor cooking in some neighborhoods. Communal interactions around markets and stoops. Women sometimes prepared simpler meals to avoid overheating kitchens. Cold bread with cheese, sliced tomatoes, leftover beans from earlier cooking. Let's pause and imagine a summer evening. Windows open. The city buzzing. A faint breeze moving through narrow streets. Dinner might be bread, a slice of cheese, perhaps some pickled vegetables. Maybe a tomato sliced and salted. Simple, cool, minimal cooking. Children playing outside until dusk. Adults sitting on stoops, sharing gossip. Sharing food occasionally. Seasonal rhythms shape not just what people ate, but how they ate. In winter, meals were indoor, tight, survival-focused. In summer, meals sometimes spilled outward into shared spaces. Now let's gently explore preservation methods, because they were the quiet backbone of seasonal survival. Salting was common. Pork heavily salted in autumn when pigs were slaughtered. The salt drew out moisture, preserving the meat for months, but it also made it intensely salty. So soaking was required before cooking, time-consuming, water-dependent. Pickling preserved vegetables. Cucumbers, cabbage, even beets. Vinegar and salt created acidity that discouraged spoilage. Pickles added brightness to otherwise bland winter plates. Drying was another method. Beans dried thoroughly. Apples sliced and dried for later use. Dried apple slices could be rehydrated into pies or stews. Smoking preserved meat and fish, though urban smoking was less common among the very poor due to limited space. Preservation meant planning, which meant stability, which meant hoping wages in autumn were enough to buy extra food for winter storage. But many families lived week to week. Preservation requires surplus. Surplus was rare. Charitable organizations often saw higher demand in winter. Soup kitchens served longer lines. Churches distributed bread and coal. Newspapers reported on the deserving poor, a phrase that carried more judgment than compassion. Still, mutual aid existed within communities. Neighbors shared when possible. A pot of stew stretched to include one more person. A loaf divided. Let's gently glide toward another quiet domestic scene. It's late February, snow melting into slush outside. Inside, a pot of barley soup simmers. Barley is affordable, nutritious, underappreciated. A mother adds the last of the dried beans. A small carrot saved from autumn. The soup is thin, but it's hot. The family eats. There is no dessert, no fruit, just warmth. And that warmth, in winter, is enough. Now imagine August. The same family, months later. Windows open. A plate of sliced tomatoes from the market. Bread. Maybe a small piece of salted fish. A wedge of watermelon shared among children. Not abundance, but variety. Seasonality made diets slightly more diverse over the year than a single snapshot might suggest. Summer offered nutrients winter denied. Winter demanded preservation skills summer made possible. Through it all, food remained predictable, repetitive, grounded in necessity. No elaborate banquets, no dramatic feasts. Just steady cycles of porridge, bread, cabbage, beans, and whatever small variations the season allowed. Now we're talking about money. Not in a stressful, modern bills due tomorrow way. More in a quiet 1800s. If I buy onions today, can we still afford coal? Way. In 19th century New York, wages for working-class families were low, unpredictable, and deeply dependent on industry. A male laborer working on docks or construction might earn somewhere between $1 and $1.50 a day in the mid-1800s, sometimes less during economic downturns. Women working in garment factories often earned half that. Children earned even less. Now, before we judge those numbers too casually, remember that prices were lower too, but not low enough. Rent in a crowded tenement might cost $8 to $12 a month for a small, poorly ventilated apartment. If multiple families shared space, it could be slightly cheaper per person. Slightly. Coal for heating and cooking was another expense. Bread had to be purchased regularly. Meat, when possible, was a splurge. So imagine the arithmetic. A man earns $6 in a week, assuming steady work. Out of that comes rent, coal, maybe kerosene for lamps, soap, thread, shoes when the old ones fall apart. Food must stretch across what remains. Bread was often the single biggest food expense. Cheap loaves might cost 3 to 5 cents. A family could easily go through multiple loaves per week. Potatoes were affordable, thankfully. A blessing in a city where many other things were not. A bushel of potatoes could feed a family for days. Beans were inexpensive and filling. Dried beans were particularly economical because they expanded during cooking. One small bag became an entire pot. Meat was measured carefully. A pound of salt pork might cost 10 to 15 cents. But that pound would not be eaten in one sitting. It would be shaved into small pieces, rendered, used to flavor multiple meals. Now let's picture that table again. Coins stacked, rent due in 3 days. A mother, because women often handle daily food purchases, calculates silently. If she buys flour in bulk, it's cheaper per pound. But bulk requires upfront cash. If she buys smaller amounts daily, it costs more long-term, but fits the immediate budget. This is not just cooking. This is strategy. Pushcart markets were often slightly cheaper than formal shops. Less overhead. More bargaining. But quality varied. Late in the day, prices dropped. Vendors preferred selling produce at discount rather than hauling it back unsold. So savvy shoppers waited until evening. The risk, of course, was that the best items were already gone. Economic downturns made everything worse. The Panic of 1837 triggered widespread unemployment. Suddenly, daily wages vanished. Breadlines grew. Charitable soup kitchens expanded. Again in the 1870s, the Long Depression hit hard. Factories closed, wages dropped. Families that had barely been stable slid into deeper insecurity. In these moments, diets became even more restricted. Meat disappeared first, then butter, then variety. What remained was the absolute foundation: bread, potatoes, beans, cabbage. Wealthier New Yorkers might have debated the merits of imported cheeses. Poor families debated whether cabbage would last 3 days or 4. Let's gently explore gender roles in this equation. Men earned wages typically. Women stretched them. Women shopped daily when possible. Without refrigeration, daily shopping made sense, but it also allowed for price comparison. One stall might sell onions cheaper than another. Another might have discounted bruised apples. Cooking itself was labor-intensive. Bread baked at home required time and fuel. Stews required hours of simmering. Beans needed soaking overnight. Time was currency too. Women working outside the home, particularly in garment factories, faced double labor. Long shifts, then cooking at night. Meals might be simpler on workdays. More reliance on bread and ready-made items. Boarders provided additional income for some families. Renting a bed or floor space brought in extra coins. But it also meant feeding more people, which meant stews stretched thinner. Children contributed wages in many households. Newsboys selling papers. Young girls working in textile mills. Their pennies mattered. Sometimes children were sent on errands specifically to compare prices across markets. A small lesson in urban economics before adolescence. Now let's talk about credit. Small neighborhood grocers sometimes extended credit to regular customers. Not out of pure generosity, but mutual dependency. The grocer needed customers. The family needed food. A notebook behind the counter might list debts. Paid off when wages came in, hopefully. But credit was fragile. If a family fell too far behind, the grocer might refuse further extension. And then options narrowed drastically. Pawn shops were another safety valve. A coat pawned in spring, redeemed in autumn if possible. Jewelry, if there was any, temporarily exchanged for food money. It's all very quiet, very practical. Now imagine Sunday. Sunday dinners were often slightly better, even among the poor. Because Sunday was a day off for some industries. And psychologically, a nicer meal marked the week. Perhaps a small roast chicken shared among many. More likely, a slightly thicker stew. Maybe a dessert rice pudding, sweetened lightly. Rice was affordable and versatile. Rice pudding, made with milk and a bit of sugar or molasses, felt celebratory. Celebration mattered. Holidays required saving weeks in advance. Christmas might include a goose if a family had done exceptionally well. More often, it was a chicken. Or just better bread and a sweeter pudding. Now let's gently zoom out and consider food prices fluctuating. Seasonal abundance lowered prices. Summer vegetables were cheaper. Winter scarcity raised costs. Imports affected markets too. Trade disruptions could spike certain food prices. And poor families had little buffer against sudden increases. Economic inequality was stark. While tenement families counted pennies for cabbage, wealthy families dined on multiple courses. Imported wines, fresh meats year-round, ice delivered daily. The contrast was visible, sometimes literally across the same street. But our focus stays here, in the small apartment. A candle burning low, coins counted twice, then a third time. Rent must be paid first. Eviction loomed quickly in crowded neighborhoods. Landlords were not sentimental. Food was flexible only to a point. You could water down soup. But you couldn't eliminate eating entirely. Malnutrition crept in slowly. Not starvation in the dramatic sense, but chronic undernourishment. Children thin. Adults perpetually tired. Yet communities adapted. Mutual aid societies formed within immigrant groups. Members contributed small amounts weekly. Funds distributed to those in temporary need, informal insurance. Churches distributed bread during hard winters. Settlement houses like those emerging in the late 1800s offered meals and education. And gradually, labor movements began pushing for higher wages and better conditions. Strikes erupted occasionally, not glamorous. Often unsuccessful at first, but persistent. Better wages meant slightly better meals. More consistent meat, more fresh produce, small improvements. Let's return to the kitchen one more time. It's payday. A small envelope placed on the table. Wages inside, carefully opened. A portion set aside for rent immediately. Another for coal. A bit for soap. A few coins for savings, if possible. What remains determines the week's menu. Flour, potatoes, beans, cabbage, maybe a small piece of beef if optimism wins. There's no spreadsheet. No budgeting app. Just experience. And experience says, stretch everything. Bread heels saved for pudding. Fat rendered and stored. Bones boiled until flavor disappears entirely. This isn't culinary innovation for fun. It's survival arithmetic. And yet, within these constraints, taste still mattered. A pinch of salt, a splash of vinegar, a spoonful of molasses. Small adjustments that made repetitive meals slightly less monotonous. Now we're going smaller, lower to the ground. Closer to eye level with a child standing in front of a pushcart, staring at a jar of bright red candy that probably contains more chemistry than fruit. Because childhood in 1800s New York had its own relationship with food. And like everything else in this city, it was complicated, practical, and occasionally a little heartbreaking. Now, childhood in poor neighborhoods was not the extended, protected phase we imagine today. Children worked. A lot. Newsboys shouted headlines in the streets. Girls stitched garments in factories. Small hands were useful. Which meant they were employed early, but children were still children. And food for them wasn't just sustenance. It was comfort. It was excitement. It was that rare moment of sweetness in an otherwise repetitive routine of bread and cabbage. Let's begin with breakfast. For many working-class children, breakfast was quick and plain. A bowl of porridge if there was time. Cornmeal mush was common. Oatmeal if oats were affordable. Usually salted rather than sweetened. Milk, if added, might be watered down. A child might eat quickly before heading out to sell newspapers or work in a mill. The meal was not designed to delight. It was designed to prevent fainting. School attendance increased as the century progressed, especially with compulsory education laws later in the 1800s. But even in school, Meals were not provided. Children brought what they had. Lunch might be a chunk of bread wrapped in cloth. Maybe an apple if in season. Perhaps a small slice of cheese. If the family had prepared soup the night before, it stayed at home. There were no thermoses, no microwaves waiting politely. So midday hunger was common, quiet, managed. Now let's drift toward something more hopeful. Penny candy. General stores and street vendors sold small candies for 1 cent. Colorful drops. Licorice sticks. Hard sugar sweets in glass jars. For a child who had earned a few pennies selling papers, this was luxury. The colors were vibrant, possibly too vibrant. As we gently mentioned before, some dyes used in 19th century candy were less than ideal. But from a child's perspective, the glow mattered more than the ingredient list. Buying candy was an act of independence. A tiny economic decision. 1 cent spent entirely on pleasure. Picture a newsboy in 1870, pockets jingling faintly. He steps up to a shop counter, points to a jar, receives 2 bright red sweets wrapped in paper, walks away triumphant. That candy might be the only sweet thing he tastes all week. Fruit also held a special place in childhood memory. Apples were the most common, affordable, durable. A mother might slice 1 apple into thin pieces to share among several children. Each slice carefully equal. In summer, watermelon slices sold cheaply from pushcarts. Sticky hands. Seeds spit into the street. A brief moment of abundance. Peaches, when slightly bruised and sold at discount, were treasures. Eaten quickly before spoilage, juice running down chins. These seasonal fruits broke the monotony of starch-heavy diets. They were remembered. Now let's talk about hunger more directly. Chronic undernourishment shaped childhood quietly. It didn't always look dramatic. It looked like thin arms, slower growth, frequent colds. In overcrowded tenements, disease spread easily. Weak nutrition made recovery harder. Milk, ideally essential for children, was unreliable. Swill milk scandals disproportionately harmed infants. Many families boiled milk to reduce risk, but boiling required fuel and time. Some charitable groups focused specifically on feeding children. Bread and milk programs emerged in the later 1800s. Settlement houses offered simple meals. But not every child had access. Street children, especially orphans or those abandoned, relied heavily on charity or irregular earnings. Ragpickers might trade scraps for pennies. Bootblacks shined shoes for coins. Meals for these children were unpredictable. A roll bought from a bakery, leftover food from a market stall, occasionally a bowl of soup from a charitable kitchen. Let's imagine a winter afternoon. A small boy stands near a bakery window. The air smells of fresh bread. Warm, yeasty, comforting. He doesn't have enough money for a full loaf. But maybe he can afford a day-old roll at discount. He counts his coins carefully, purchases one, holds it close for warmth before eating. That roll might serve as both lunch and dinner. Now let's shift gently to family meals. For children living with family, dinner was communal. Bowls passed around, portions modest. Children were often served after adults, especially fathers who performed physically demanding labor. Not out of cruelty, out of necessity. The wage earner needed strength to return to work. So a child might receive a slightly smaller portion of stew. More broth than solids. Bread dipped thoroughly to absorb flavor. But there was comfort in routine. Children remember repetition, the smell of cabbage simmering, the scrape of spoons on tin bowls, the taste of molasses stirred into porridge on rare generous mornings. Even thin soup can become nostalgic when it is shared. Now let's gently consider treats beyond candy. Ice cream existed in the 1800s, though not widely accessible to the poorest families. Street vendors sometimes sold small portions in summer, cheap versions, served in tiny glasses or cones later in the century. For a child who had never tasted ice cream before, that cold sweetness would feel extraordinary. Holiday meals were particularly vivid in memory. Christmas might bring a slightly larger portion of meat. A special pudding, perhaps raisins baked into bread. Raisins were not everyday ingredients, they were festive. A birthday, if acknowledged, might include a small cake. More often, it was simply another day. Still, parents tried. A mother saving pennies for weeks might surprise her child with a sweet bun from a bakery. A father might bring home a small piece of sausage on Sunday. Small gestures mattered deeply. Now let's gently address work again. Child labor meant physical exhaustion, and physical exhaustion increased hunger. Newsboys often shouted headlines from dawn until late evening. They might eat on the go. Bread carried in pockets, sometimes sharing among themselves. Factory children ate quickly during short breaks. Food had to be simple and portable, and yet, children adapted socially around food too. Sharing bites, trading pieces of bread for apple slices, pooling pennies for candy. Food created small communities even among the youngest. Let's pause and imagine a summer evening on a tenement stoop. Children sit together. One has a slice of watermelon. Another has a piece of bread. They exchange bites, laugh quietly. The city hums around them. It's not abundance, but it's connection. Nutritionally, these diets were limited. Protein inconsistent, fresh vegetable seasonal, dairy unreliable. But resilience was built into routine. Children grew up knowing the value of food intimately. No crumbs wasted. Plates wiped clean. Leftover bread became pudding. Stale crusts softened in soup. Even scraps fed to animals if families kept chickens in small backyard spaces. Now, as the century progressed toward the late 1800s, reformers increasingly focused on child welfare. School lunch programs were not yet standard, but discussions began. Settlement houses offered classes on nutrition. Clean milk campaigns gained traction. Gradually, awareness grew that children needed more than survival calories. But for much of the century, survival itself was the goal. Now we're stepping into the world of charity kitchens. By the mid to late 1800s, New York's poverty was impossible to ignore. Reformers, journalists, ministers, and social workers began documenting conditions in tenements. And when they described the diets of the poor, it was often with a tone that mixed genuine concern and just a hint of moral commentary. Because of course there was. Soup kitchens were one of the earliest organized responses to urban hunger. Churches and benevolent societies distributed soup and bread, especially during winters or economic downturns. The idea was simple. Large vats of inexpensive soup could feed many people quickly. The soup itself was usually made from bones, barley, rice, potatoes, onions, and whatever vegetables were affordable in bulk. It was thin, efficient, filling enough. Recipients often received a ladleful in their own containers, sometimes a chunk of bread alongside it. Occasionally a ticket system was used, families given soup tickets to redeem at certain times. The system wasn't glamorous, but it was structured. Let's picture one of these kitchens in the 1870s. A large iron pot steaming. Volunteers stirring slowly. The smell of onion and broth filling the room. Families step forward one by one. A bowl extended. A ladle dips. Steam rises. A small nod exchanged. It's quiet dignity, mostly. Now here's where it gets gently complicated. Charity often came with expectations. Reformers frequently believed that poverty was not only economic, but moral, which meant food assistance sometimes carried advice. Advice about thrift, advice about temperance, advice about how cabbage should be cooked more efficiently. Settlement houses, like those emerging in the 1880s and 1890s, took a slightly different approach. These were community centers established in poor neighborhoods by middle-class reformers who wanted to uplift immigrant communities. They offered classes, English lessons, sewing instruction, and yes, cooking demonstrations. Because apparently boiling cabbage for generations was not quite sophisticated enough. Now, to be fair, some of this instruction genuinely helped. Lessons on sanitation reduced illness. Demonstrations on balanced meals introduced ideas about nutrition that were still developing scientifically. But there was often a subtle tone of superiority. Imagine a reform-minded instructor standing in a modest kitchen, demonstrating how to prepare a wholesome meal with limited means. She explains the importance of vegetables, of milk, of variety. Meanwhile, the women watching her are thinking, very calmly, yes, that would be lovely if we had the money. Still, these programs sometimes introduced new ingredients. Oatmeal gained popularity partly through such efforts. It was affordable, nutritious, and heavily promoted as a model breakfast. Bread reform was another focus. White bread was considered less nutritious than whole grain bread. Reformers encouraged brown bread. Ironically, many poor families were already eating darker breads out of necessity. Milk reform became a major movement. After public outrage over swill milk, activists pushed for pasteurization and better dairy oversight. Clean milk stations were established in some neighborhoods, providing safer milk for infants at reduced prices. This likely saved lives. Infant mortality rates gradually declined toward the end of the century, thanks in part to improved milk safety and sanitation. Let's pause and imagine a mother in 1895 visiting a milk station. She hands over a small coin, receives a bottle of cleaner, pasteurized milk. It's still precious, still rationed carefully, but safer. She walks home through crowded streets, the bottle wrapped in cloth, hopeful. Now let's gently shift to charitable bread lines. During severe economic downturns, like the Panic of 1893, unemployment soared. Bread lines became longer. Newspapers published images of men waiting patiently for loaves. Bread was symbolic, simple, foundational. Charities distributed loaves daily. Some required proof of need. Others operated more openly. For many men, standing at a bread line carried shame. Work was tied to identity. And without wages, dignity felt fragile. But hunger overrides pride eventually, so they stood, quietly, hats in hand. Now let's float into the kitchens of reform-minded middle-class observers. Cookbooks began appearing that specifically addressed economical cooking. These books often targeted working-class women. They included recipes for inexpensive soups, bean dishes, rice puddings. Some of these recipes were practical. Others underestimated just how limited budgets could be. There's a certain gentle irony in advising someone to add more fresh vegetables when fresh vegetables cost money. Still, knowledge circulated. Public markets improved gradually. Health inspections became more common by the late 19th century. Water infrastructure improved. Sewers expanded. All of this indirectly affected food safety. Now let's talk about school meals. By the very end of the 19th century and into the early 20th, experimental school lunch programs began appearing. Not widespread yet, but pilot programs recognized that hungry children struggled to learn. Early school meals were simple: bread and milk, sometimes soup. Again, nothing elaborate, just enough to steady concentration. Settlement houses also organized communal dinners for children. Nutritious, supervised meals, often paired with moral instruction, because apparently soup was best served with the side of character development. Let's gently return to the tenements. Did charity eliminate hunger? No. Did it ease the sharpest edges during crises? Sometimes. Most families still relied primarily on their own budgeting, their own cooking, their own quiet resilience. Charity was supplemental, temporary, seasonal, and sometimes unevenly distributed. Immigrant communities often relied heavily on internal support networks. Mutual aid societies provided assistance without as much moralizing. Members contributed small dues. Funds supported those facing illness or unemployment. Religious organizations played a major role too. Catholic parishes, Jewish charities, Protestant missions, all distributed food at various times. Each community shaped its assistance according to its own traditions. Now imagine a cold December evening in 1890. A family returns home with a loaf from a charity distribution. It's dense, fresh enough. They slice it carefully. Pair it with thin soup. The loaf stretches 2 days, maybe 3. In the same building, another family receives help from a mutual aid society. A small basket delivered quietly. Beans, flour, perhaps a small piece of meat. These acts were rarely dramatic. They were modest, practical. Food relief did not transform diets into abundance. It prevented absolute collapse. And yet, reform movements did slowly change the city. By the end of the century, awareness of nutrition increased. Sanitation reforms reduced contamination. Food inspection laws gained traction. The groundwork was being laid for the progressive era's broader reforms. But in the 1800s themselves, most change was incremental, gradual, uneven. The average poor family still relied on bread, potatoes, beans, cabbage, and occasional meat. Charity might add a ladle of soup, a loaf, a bottle of safer milk. Let's end with a quiet image. A long wooden bench inside a settlement house dining room. Children sitting side by side. Bowls of soup placed in front of them. Steam curling upward. An instructor walks between tables, offering polite advice about chewing thoroughly. The children eat, quietly, efficiently. For them, it's not about reform ideology. It's about warmth, fullness, routine. And outside, the city continues its steady expansion. Pushcarts rattle. Bakeries close for the night. Tenement windows glow faintly. It's the late 1890s now. The century is stretching toward its end. New York is louder than ever, taller, more crowded. Elevated trains rattle overhead. Factories hum with relentless rhythm. And yet, in the narrow streets of the Lower East Side, dinner still looks remarkably familiar. Bread, potatoes, beans, cabbage, a little meat if fortune allows. But subtle shifts are happening, not dramatic ones. No overnight transformation into abundance, just gradual changes, like steam slowly lifting from a pot. Let's begin with the streets themselves. Pushcarts had become one of the defining features of poor neighborhoods by the late 19th century. Vendors lined entire blocks, selling produce, pickles, fish, bread, fruit. The air thick with overlapping smells. Pushcarts were affordable businesses. Lower overhead than storefronts, which meant prices could be slightly lower. Competition was fierce. Vendors shouted prices in Yiddish, Italian, German, Irish accented English. For poor families, pushcarts were lifelines. Imagine walking down Hester Street in 1898. Barrels of pickles, piles of onions, strings of garlic, dried fish hanging, apples stacked in pyramids that wobble slightly. You pause at one cart. Tomatoes are cheap today. Slightly bruised, but salvageable. The vendor shrugs. 3 cents. You hand over coins. Dinner improves slightly. Eastern European Jewish immigrants, arriving in large numbers in the 1880s and 1890s, added new textures to the city's food landscape. Pickled foods became even more prominent. Sour pickles from large barrels, pickled herring, rye bread dense and dark. Delicatessens began appearing, small shops selling cured meats, smoked fish, bread. Not luxury establishments, just practical places to grab food that felt familiar. Bagels were sold from baskets, hand-rolled, boiled, baked, chewy, affordable. For immigrant families, these foods were anchors of identity. They might be poor, but they could still taste something that reminded them of home. Italian neighborhoods expanded too. Pasta production became more organized. Small factories began producing dried pasta more efficiently. That made pasta cheaper and more accessible. Tomato sauces simmered in crowded kitchens. Garlic sizzling in oil. A sharp, comforting smell cutting through coal smoke. Irish communities remained rooted in their staples. Potatoes never left. Cabbage persisted. But over time, diets blended. Cultures mixed. Ingredients crossed boundaries. A German bakery might sell bread to an Irish family. An Italian vendor might buy pickles from a Jewish supplier. Poverty created proximity. Proximity created exchange. Now let's talk about regulation. By the turn of the century, public awareness about food safety had grown significantly. Investigative journalism had exposed unsanitary conditions in meatpacking plants and dairies. Although the most famous reforms would come slightly later, like the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, the momentum built during the 1890s. Health inspectors began appearing more regularly in markets. Milk stations expanded. Pasteurization gained broader acceptance. Gradually, milk became safer, not universally. Not instantly, but measurably. That meant infants had better survival chances, which meant families experienced slightly less grief tied directly to food contamination. Bread quality also improved over time as milling processes modernized. Roller milling created finer flour. Commercial bakeries scaled production. Prices stabilized somewhat. But stabilization did not equal abundance. Wages remained tight for working-class families. Industrial jobs were plentiful, but often low-paying and exhausting. Sweatshops churned out garments for long hours. Women continued juggling factory work and home cooking. Children still contributed wages in many households. Yet small improvements accumulated. Ice delivery became more common in urban neighborhoods by the late 1800s. Ice wagons clattered through streets, delivering blocks for ice boxes. Even poor families sometimes purchased small pieces of ice during hot months. That extended food life slightly. Milk lasted longer. Leftovers survived a bit better. It wasn't modern refrigeration, but it helped. Let's gently imagine a summer day in 1900. A mother buys a small chunk of ice, wraps it in cloth, places it in a simple ice box. Milk stays cool for an extra day. Tomatoes remain firm slightly longer. Dinner might include sliced tomatoes, bread, and a small portion of cured meat. Perhaps even leftovers from yesterday's stew. Leftovers surviving 24 hours was quietly revolutionary. Now let's float into labor activism for a moment. As unions grew stronger toward the end of the century, wages in some industries improved slightly, not dramatically, but enough that occasional meat consumption increased. Sunday dinners might include beef more reliably, not every week, but more often than in 1840. Street food also evolved. Hot dogs derived from German sausages became increasingly popular. Sold from carts, affordable, portable, a quick protein boost for laborers. Pretzels, roasted nuts, pickles sold individually. These weren't luxury foods, but they added variety. Variety matters psychologically. Imagine eating cabbage every day for months, then suddenly tasting something smoky, or sour, or spicy. It wakes you up. And even in sleepy, monotone storytelling, we can appreciate that. Let's consider tenement kitchens again. By 1900, some housing reforms had begun addressing ventilation and sanitation. Not everywhere, not uniformly, but improvements were underway. Better ventilation meant slightly cooler kitchens in summer, slightly less dampness in winter. Cooking remained basic. One-pot meals dominated, but ingredients slowly diversified. Rice became more common across communities. Cheaper imports, versatile, filling. Beans remained essential. Lentils too. Coffee quality improved gradually with better import systems. Though chicory never fully disappeared. Tea remained beloved among Irish families, served hot, even in summer sometimes. Because habits endure. Now let's gently address the emotional side of food at the turn of the century. Immigrant families who had arrived with almost nothing sometimes saw modest upward mobility after years of labor. A father promoted. A small business opened. A son finishing school. With improved income came slightly improved meals. A larger roast on holidays, more frequent fruit, perhaps even dessert outside of major celebrations. Food marked progress. But poverty did not vanish. New immigrants continued arriving, Crowded neighborhoods remained crowded. Wage gaps persisted. The city was layered. Some families climbed slowly. Others remained stuck. And yet, across decades, one can trace improvement. Safer milk, more reliable bread, slightly more accessible meat, better water infrastructure. The Croton water system, expanded over time, provided cleaner water than earlier decades. That reduced waterborne illness, which indirectly improved nutrition by preventing constant disease cycles. Health and food are intertwined. Let's end with one more quiet domestic scene. It's 1901, a small apartment in the Lower East Side. Dinner is simple but slightly more varied than it might have been in 1830. There's bread, always bread. There's a pot of beans flavored with a modest piece of meat. There's sliced tomato and onion salad. Perhaps even a small pickle on each plate. A child asks for more bread. There's enough, not abundance, but enough. And that word enough marks the slow shift across the century. From barely scraping by to cautiously stable for some. From chalk-laced milk to safer bottles. From purely survival calories to occasional small pleasures. The transformation was gradual, uneven, imperfect, but real. When we look back at 19th century New York, at the docks, the factories, the tenements, we often think about steel, brick, railroads, and skyscrapers. But none of it rises without calories, and those calories were humble. Throughout the century, the city ran on bread, potatoes, beans, cabbage, and watered milk. On salted meat and cheap fish. On coffee stretched thin and stew stretched thinner. The labor that carved streets, laid tracks, stitched garments, and stacked bricks was fueled not by abundance, but by adequacy. Barely adequate sometimes. Let's zoom out slowly. In the early 1800s, diets were repetitive and fragile. A disruption in supply, bad weather, dock delays, economic panic could ripple directly into hunger. The working poor lived close to the edge. By mid-century, markets expanded. Transportation improved. Railroads connected farms to the city more efficiently. The Erie Canal and expanding rail lines widened the food network feeding Manhattan. Food variety increased, even for the poor. Not dramatically, but measurably. By the late 1800s, industrialization had changed not only how people worked, but how food moved, how it was processed, and how it was sold. Roller mills produced finer flour. Large bakeries produced bread at scale. Ice delivery slowed spoilage. Milk reform campaigns improved safety. Pushcarts increased neighborhood access. None of these changes created luxury, but they created resilience. And resilience is what allows a city to grow. Think of a dock worker in 1820 eating bread and salted pork before unloading ships by hand. Now think of a factory worker in 1895 eating bread, beans, and occasionally beef before tending industrial machinery. Both meals are simple. Both are repetitive. But the second worker lives in a city with better water, slightly safer milk, more reliable distribution, and marginally higher wages. That difference, small but steady, accumulates across decades. Now let's reflect on the immigrant story. Every wave of newcomers arrived with culinary memory. Irish families brought potatoes and tea. German immigrants brought sausages and rye bread. Italian families brought pasta and tomatoes. Eastern European Jewish communities brought pickled fish, dense breads, and careful food traditions shaped by centuries of adaptation. In crowded neighborhoods, these traditions mingled. Over time, cabbage met tomato sauce. Rye bread met Irish stew. Pickles became universal. The food of the poor became the foundation of the city's identity. Today, people travel across the world to eat New York bagels, deli sandwiches, pizza slices, hot dogs from street carts. But these began as survival foods, affordable, portable, efficient, filling. They were never meant to be iconic. They were meant to be enough. There's something deeply human about that. Let's talk briefly about children. In the early 1800s, many working-class children were undernourished. Illness was common. Growth was stunted. Milk was unreliable. By 1900, while poverty still existed, public health reforms, improved infrastructure, and better distribution systems meant more children survived infancy. School lunch programs were not yet widespread. Welfare systems were minimal. But community kitchens, charity societies, and settlement houses began offering assistance. Food slowly became recognized not just as private survival, but as public responsibility. That shift matters. Now imagine the skyline again, the Brooklyn Bridge. The expanding grid of Manhattan, factories in Brooklyn, rail lines stretching north. All of it built by people who ate cabbage and bread. It's easy to romanticize grand banquets of the wealthy silverware glittering under chandeliers. But the true engine of the city simmered in dented pots and overheated kitchens. Beans bubbling quietly. Potatoes softening in thin broth. Bread torn by hand and passed around a small wooden table. If you listen closely, you could almost hear it, the steady rhythm of chewing before dawn. The scrape of spoons against tin bowls. The soft clink of glass milk bottles delivered at daybreak. No orchestra. Just nourishment. And that nourishment built railroads. It laid brick. It stitched clothing. It dug foundations. It raised bridges. By the time the 20th century arrived, New York was no longer a fragile port town struggling to feed itself. It was a vast industrial metropolis supported by expanding national supply chains, improving public health standards, and an increasingly diverse culinary base. The meals remained modest for many, but they were more stable, safer, slightly more varied. And stability is power. So when we think about the rise of New York, we should think not only of steel beams and financiers, but of bread, of potatoes, of beans, of milk that no longer killed as often, of immigrant mothers stretching soup one more day, of fathers carrying lunch pails filled with yesterday's stew. The city did not rise on luxury, it rose on enough. And that quiet, steady enough carried it into the modern age. We step gently into the early 20th century. The city is no longer just expanding, it's accelerating. The skyline begins climbing higher. Subways open beneath the streets. Electricity flickers into homes. Immigration continues. Industry surges. And in kitchens, small, crowded, overheated kitchens, something transformative begins to happen. Not all at once, not everywhere, but steadily. Let's begin with ice. For decades, ice had been harvested from frozen lakes in winter, cut into blocks, stored in insulated warehouses and delivered by horse-drawn wagons. By the early 1900s, the ice trade was vast and organized. Then mechanical refrigeration began changing everything. Large-scale refrigeration systems appeared in warehouses and food distribution centers first. Meat-packing plants could now store meat longer. Railcars equipped with ice compartments transported beef from Chicago more efficiently. Suddenly, the working-class family in New York had access to more consistent meat supplies, still not abundant, but more predictable. Now let's move into the home. Electricity spread gradually. Wealthier households adopted electric refrigerators in the 1910s and 1920s. Working-class families often continued using iceboxes longer. But even iceboxes improved. Better insulation, more reliable ice delivery, less spoilage, milk lasted longer, leftovers survived safely. Butter didn't melt as quickly in summer heat. This changed daily cooking rhythms. Previously, food had to be consumed quickly. Spoilage was constant anxiety. Now, there was a small buffer of time. Time changes behavior. A mother could cook slightly larger batches. A worker could save part of dinner for tomorrow's lunch. Food waste decreased. Then came gas stoves. Coal stoves had dominated 19th century kitchens, heavy, smoky, labor-intensive. Gas lines expanded through urban neighborhoods in the early 20th century, bringing cleaner, more controllable heat. Cooking became more precise. Flames adjusted instantly. No more hauling coal. No more waiting for embers to settle. That efficiency mattered. Working class. Women, many juggling wage labor and domestic work, gain minutes and hours back from the process of cooking. Technology does not eliminate labor, but it reshapes it. Now let's look at food itself. Industrial food production exploded in the early 1900s. Canned goods became increasingly common. Companies mass-produced canned vegetables, soups, beans, and meats. Shelf-stable food meant security. Pantries grew slightly more varied. A can of tomatoes, a tin of sardines, evaporated milk, canned corn. These items required less preparation and lasted months. The working poor did not suddenly feast, but their diets diversified. Sugar consumption increased as well. Refined sugar became cheaper and more widely available. Sweetened foods, cakes, pastries, candies entered daily life more frequently. Desserts slowly shifted from rare luxury to occasional normality. Now we must mention a turning point in public health. After the publication of exposes like Upton Sinclair's The Jungle in 1906, public outrage pushed federal reform. The Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act of 1906 established standards for food safety. Contamination did not vanish, but regulation existed. Milk pasteurization became far more widespread. Meat inspections became standardized. Food labeling improved gradually. The anxiety of hidden danger in basic staples diminished. That psychological shift is subtle but profound. Eating became slightly less risky. Now imagine a kitchen in 1925. Still small. Still modest. Still crowded in many neighborhoods. But different from 1825 in quiet, revolutionary ways. There is an icebox, perhaps even a small electric refrigerator in more prosperous households. A gas stove, canned goods on a shelf, pasteurized milk in glass bottles, packaged bread from a commercial bakery. Dinner might include meat purchased fresh from a butcher that morning and safely stored until evening. There might be fresh fruit year-round thanks to improved transportation and refrigeration networks. Bananas, once exotic, become common. Oranges more available. Food seasonality begins to blur. That blurring transforms expectations. Children growing up in the 1920s expect fruit in winter. Their grandparents did not. Expectations shape culture. Now let's talk about supermarkets. The first true supermarkets would emerge in the 1930s, but even before that, grocery stores expanded in size and scope. Self-service models began appearing. Instead of relying solely on pushcarts or small specialty shops, families could enter a single store and purchase multiple items. Choice expanded. Choice creates identity. You are no longer limited to what your neighborhood vendor carries. You select brands. You compare prices. You exercise preference. Food becomes not just survival but consumer experience. Yet inequality persisted. The Great Depression would soon disrupt stability. Soup kitchens would reappear. Bread lines would stretch long again. Progress is never linear. But even during hardship, the technological infrastructure remained. Refrigeration, canning, pasteurization, inspection. The baseline of safety and distribution never fully returned to 19th century fragility. That's the key difference. By the early 20th century, New York was no longer vulnerable to the same level of food chaos that haunted its early decades. The city had built systems. Systems fed millions. And those systems were built on the long history we've just walked through, from chalked milk to pasteurized bottles, from coal stoves to gas burners, from salted pork barrels to refrigerated rail cars, from survival stew to canned soup in a pantry. The meals may still have been simple, but they were modern. And modernity in the kitchen begins with control. Control over temperature, control over time, control over safety, control over variety. All things the 19th century poor rarely had. So as the 20th century unfolds, food in New York shifts from fragile to structured, from local to national, from seasonal to year-round. The pot still simmers, but now it simmers in a kitchen wired for electricity. And that changes everything. We move into the 1930s. The skyline is taller now. Subways rumble beneath the city. Electric lights glow in apartment windows. But something has shifted. Work has slowed. Factories have closed. Pay envelopes have disappeared. The Great Depression arrives like a long winter that refuses to end. For millions in New York, food insecurity returns not because distribution systems failed, but because wages did. That distinction matters. In the 1800s, scarcity often meant food simply wasn't available or safe. In the 1930s, food existed. People just couldn't afford it. And so, a familiar image reappears in a modern city: breadlines. Men in worn coats standing shoulder to shoulder. Hats pulled low, hands in pockets. Waiting quietly outside churches, missions, and charity kitchens. Organizations like the Salvation Army and countless neighborhood groups distributed soup, bread, and coffee. The meals were simple: a ladle of soup, a slice of bread, sometimes a small piece of fruit. It wasn't comfort food. It was continuity food. Enough to get through another day. Now imagine the emotional landscape. In the 19th century, poverty had been expected in working-class neighborhoods. Hardship was familiar. But by the 1930s, many families had tasted modest stability: iceboxes, canned goods, regular wages. To fall backward felt different, humiliating, uncertain. Yet something else had changed since the 1800s: government involvement. Under President Franklin D. Roosevelt, New Deal programs began reshaping the relationship between citizens and food security. Public works programs created jobs. Agricultural policies stabilized farm prices. Relief programs distributed food directly. For the first time at scale, the federal government acknowledged food access as a national issue. School lunch programs expanded in the 1930s, partly as relief for struggling farmers and partly to combat child malnutrition. Children who might have gone hungry in earlier centuries now received structured meals during school days: milk, soup, sandwiches. It wasn't luxury, but it was systemic. And systems endure longer than charity alone. Meanwhile, technology continued quietly working in the background. Canning industries expanded further. Refrigeration improved. Food transport networks strengthened. Even as families tightened budgets, grocery stores remained stocked. Cheap calories became central again: white bread, peanut butter, potatoes, dried beans, pasta, oatmeal. These were affordable, filling, and familiar. Meat consumption declined sharply for many households. Sunday roasts shrank or vanished. Stews stretched thinner. Bones were boiled longer. Women revived 19th century habits of stretching ingredients. Leftover management became an art form. Day-old bread turned into pudding. Vegetable scraps flavored broth. Fat was saved and reused. Frugality returned not as tradition, but as necessity. Yet something remarkable happened during this period. Community kitchens and neighborhood solidarity strengthened cultural food identities. Italian families shared pasta. Jewish bakeries extended credit. Irish and German households exchanged recipes built around cheap staples. Food became mutual support. Now let's pause in a 1933 kitchen in Brooklyn. There's likely an electric refrigerator by now in many working or lower middle-class homes, though not all. There is canned food on the shelf. There is government-distributed flour. Dinner might be bean soup thickened with a bit of barley. Maybe a slice of bread. Maybe, if lucky, a small portion of inexpensive meat. Children eat first. Adults eat what remains. The ritual of prioritizing children becomes deeply ingrained during hardship. That ritual carries forward into future generations. Then, toward the late 1930s, as war production begins ramping up before America formally enters World War II, industrial employment slowly rises again. Food consumption begins stabilizing. But war introduces another shift: rationing. During World War II, sugar, meat, butter, and other goods were rationed. Families used ration books. Consumption was monitored. Unlike the Depression, rationing was framed as collective sacrifice. Everyone participated, rich and poor alike. Victory gardens appeared across urban neighborhoods. Families grew vegetables in small plots, rooftops, vacant lots, tomatoes, beans, lettuce, carrots. The act of growing food returned to the city in a new way: voluntary, patriotic, communal. Food once again connected survival to identity. But this time, infrastructure remained strong. Pasteurized milk, refrigeration, commercial bakeries, food inspection laws. The foundation built over a century did not crumble. It flexed. And when the war ended in 1945, something unprecedented happened. Abundance. Industrial capacity that had fueled wartime production shifted toward consumer goods. Supermarkets expanded rapidly. Frozen foods entered homes. Television advertising reshaped food culture. Suburbanization changed shopping patterns. But that is another chapter. For now, we stand at the end of the Depression and the Second World War, looking back across more than a century of meals. From 1800s dockworkers eating salted pork, to 1890s pushcart tomatoes, to 1920s iceboxes, to 1930s breadlines, to 1940s ration books. The story of food in New York is not one of constant improvement. It is a story of pressure, adaptation, reform, setback, resilience. The city learned how to feed millions. Not perfectly, not equally, but structurally. And structure changes destiny. The war ends in 1945. Factories that once produced tanks and aircraft pivot toward refrigerators, automobiles, packaged foods, and home appliances. Soldiers return. Families expand. The baby boom begins. New York remains dense and vertical, but just beyond it, something new spreads outward. Suburbs. Highways expand. Supermarkets follow. The American food system, already industrialized, now becomes fully consumer-driven. Let's step into a grocery store in 1955. Not a cramped corner shop, not a pushcart, not a small ethnic bakery, but a bright, wide-aisled supermarket. Metal carts, fluorescent lights, endless shelves. Self-service shopping becomes standard. Instead of telling a grocer what you need, you walk the aisles yourself. You choose brands, you compare packaging. Choice becomes spectacle. Companies compete visually. Labels grow colorful. Slogans grow bold. Frozen foods expand rapidly thanks to advances pioneered by figures like Clarence Birdseye, whose innovations in quick freezing decades earlier now shape entire freezer sections. Frozen peas, frozen fish sticks, frozen dinners. Dinner can now come from a box. For working mothers, especially as more women re-enter the workforce in the 1950s and 1960s, convenience matters. Television reshapes expectations. Cooking shows and advertisements redefine the ideal American meal. Processed bread becomes soft and uniform. Brands like Wonder Bread symbolize modernity. Sliced, packaged, consistent. Milk arrives in standardized cartons. Breakfast cereals multiply. Sugar consumption rises dramatically. Calories are no longer scarce. They are engineered. Now let's return specifically to New York City. While suburban supermarkets flourish, the city retains its dense food culture. Ethnic neighborhoods remain vibrant. In Little Italy, pizza, once an immigrant street food, expands beyond its original community roots. By mid-century, the style popularized by pizzerias like Lombardi's gains broader appeal. Pizza becomes not just immigrant food, but New York food. Bagels, once sold from baskets in Jewish neighborhoods, spread citywide. Delicatessens flourish. Pastrami sandwiches stack higher. Hot dogs become inseparable from ballparks and street corners, especially associated with places like Coney Island. What began as working-class sustenance becomes cultural identity. But abundance carries complexity. The 1960s and 1970s reveal new issues. Highly processed foods increase. sugar and fat consumption climb. Diet-related health concerns emerge. Ironically, after a century spent escaping undernourishment, America begins confronting overconsumption. Food deserts persist in poorer neighborhoods. Inequality remains embedded in access. Fast food expands aggressively. Chains like McDonald's redefine speed and scale. Efficiency becomes central. 30-second service. Standardized menus, predictable taste. The industrial logic that once preserved milk and stabilized bread now produces hyper-consistent burgers. Yet New York resists full homogenization. Street carts remain. Delis survive. Bodegas anchor neighborhoods. Even as corporate chains rise, independent food culture persists. Now let's imagine a 1975 apartment in Queens. There is a full refrigerator. There is a freezer compartment stocked with frozen vegetables. There are boxed cereals in the cabinet. There is soda in glass bottles. There's white sandwich bread. There might also be tortillas, soy sauce, or Caribbean spices depending on the family. Immigration continues reshaping the city. Caribbean communities introduce new flavors. Chinese immigrants expand Chinatown. Korean groceries appear. Latin American cuisine spread across boroughs. Abundance now includes global diversity. The city's table grows wider. By the late 20th century, New York becomes one of the most diverse food landscapes on Earth. And yet, if we trace backward, the foundation remains familiar. Bread, rice, beans, potatoes, milk, meat. The difference is scale. The difference is refrigeration. The difference is distribution. The difference is marketing. The difference is control. Where 19th century families feared spoilage and contamination, 20th century families navigate packaging and branding. The anxiety shifts from "is this safe?" to "is this healthy?" A very different question. And so we arrive at a strange full circle. The city that once survived on cabbage and salted pork now debates organic produce, artisanal bread, and locally sourced milk. Farmers' markets return to urban streets. Home cooking trends resurface. People rediscover fermentation, something immigrants practiced out of necessity generations earlier. History loops, pickling returns, sourdough returns, community gardens return. But this time, they are choices, not survival strategies. And that is perhaps the greatest transformation of all. From fragility to stability, to abundance, to reflection. We move into the late 20th century. Then the 21st. New York is no longer just an American city, it is global. Immigration laws change in 1965, reopening large-scale migration from Asia, Latin America, and beyond. New communities reshape neighborhoods across Queens, Brooklyn, and the Bronx. Walk through Flushing in the 1990s, Sunset Park in the 2000s, Jackson Heights at almost any time. The city's food map becomes planetary. Thai groceries, Colombian bakeries, Korean barbecue, West African markets, Dominican lunch counters. Unlike earlier immigrant waves that slowly blended into the broader culture, late 20th century New York preserves parallel culinary worlds side by side. You can eat across continents in a single subway ride. Supermarkets still exist. Chains still dominate. But something new emerges in the 1990s and 2000s. Food as identity performance, artisanal bread, single origin coffee, organic milk, farm-to-table restaurants. Farmers markets expand across the city, including programs run by groups like Grow NYC, reconnecting urban consumers to regional farms. Ironically, after a century of industrialization, some New Yorkers begin seeking food that feels pre-industrial. Sourdough starters bubble in Brooklyn kitchens. Pickling returns, not because refrigeration failed, but because flavor and tradition matter. Small batch butchers reappear. The foods of survival become the foods of choice. At the same time, inequality sharpens. Luxury grocery stores sell imported cheeses and heirloom tomatoes. Meanwhile, food deserts persist in parts of the Bronx and Brooklyn. Calories are abundant, nutrition is uneven. Now we step into the digital age. Around 2010, smartphones quietly begin transforming how New Yorkers eat. Food delivery apps emerge. Platforms like Uber Eats and DoorDash turn entire neighborhoods into on-demand kitchens. No longer do you need to walk to the deli. No longer do you even call. You tap. A bike arrives. A bag appears at your door. The pushcart has evolved into an algorithm. Convenience reaches a level unimaginable in 1820 or even 1950. But something else changes too. Restaurants become data-driven. Menus are optimized for delivery durability. Ghost kitchens appear, facilities that cook only for apps with no storefront at all. Food detaches slightly from place. And yet, paradoxically, local food culture intensifies online. Instagram-worthy bagels, viral pizza slices. TikTok food tours. New York's iconic foods, pizza, bagels, deli sandwiches become global symbols amplified by digital media. A slice from a corner pizzeria travels the world through a screen. Then 2020 arrives. The COVID-19 pandemic disrupts everything. Restaurants close, supply chains strain. Grocery shelves empty briefly, not from scarcity of production, but from panic and distribution shock. For a moment, the fragility of food systems reappears. Bread baking surges in home kitchens. People rediscover dry beans. Sourdough starters become household companions. In crisis, the city echoes its past. Cooking at home. Stretching ingredients. Relying on community. Mutual aid networks form to distribute groceries. Food banks expand operations. Delivery workers become essential infrastructure. Technology allows continuity. Groceries ordered online, contactless delivery, digital payments. The 19th century fear of contaminated milk has transformed into 21st century concerns about viral transmission. Different threat, same vulnerability. But the system holds. Food keeps moving. And when restaurants reopen, outdoor dining transforms sidewalks into communal spaces, echoing the social energy of old pushcart streets. Tables spill onto avenues. Heaters glow in winter. People eat together again. Now let's pause in the present. A New York kitchen in 2025 might contain a refrigerator stocked with produce from multiple continents, almond milk beside dairy milk, leftover takeout in compostable containers, rice from Asia, avocados from Mexico, bagels from a neighborhood bakery, coffee from Ethiopia, spices from India. The entire world sits inside a small apartment refrigerator. From cabbage and salted pork to global supply chains and app-based delivery. From fragile survival to overwhelming choice. And yet, if you look closely, dinner still often comes down to something simple. Rice and vegetables, bread and protein, soup in a bowl. Food shared at a table. The forms evolve. The technology advances. The systems expand. But nourishment remains steady and human. New York was built on bread. It industrialized through canned goods and refrigeration. It globalized through migration. It digitized through apps. And through every phase, one quiet truth persists. Cities rise and fall on whether their people can eat. Not extravagantly. Not perfectly, but enough. Let's end where we began. Not with skyscrapers. Not with stock markets. Not with neon lights or delivery apps. With a table. In 1800, that table might have been rough wood in a dim room near the docks. Bread torn by hand. Salted pork sliced thin, water drawn carefully, every bite practical, every meal uncertain. In 1850, the table sat in a crowded tenement. Potatoes steaming, cabbage boiled soft, milk questionable, children quiet with hunger. In 1890, it held rye bread and pickles from a pushcart. Beans simmered all day, a sliver of meat on Sunday. In 1925, there was an icebox nearby, pasteurized milk, canned tomatoes in the pantry, a gas flame steady under a pot. In 1933, during the Great Depression, The table might have been nearly bare, but relief bread sat in the center. Shared carefully, measured. In 1943, during World War II, ration books rested beside plates. Sugar counted. Butter limited. Victory Garden tomatoes sliced proudly. In 1955, the table expanded. Supermarket bread, packaged cereal, frozen vegetables. Abundance creeping in. By 1985, it might hold pizza boxes, deli sandwiches, rice and beans from a Caribbean kitchen, dumplings from Chinatown, pasta from Little Italy. By 2025, that same table could hold sushi ordered through an app, sourdough baked at home, oat milk lattes, groceries delivered by bike, avocados from thousands of miles away. And yet, strip away packaging, strip away branding, strip away refrigeration units and fluorescent aisles. What remains? People gathering, someone cooking, someone serving. Someone asking, is there enough? That question, is there enough? Echoes across 2 centuries. New York's history of food is not a story of luxury. It is a story of systems built to answer that question more reliably. The Croton water system, milk pasteurization, rail transport, ice delivery, canning factories, food inspection laws, supermarkets, global shipping, digital delivery platforms. Each innovation reduced uncertainty. Each decade added a layer of stability. And yet stability never erased inequality entirely. Some tables were always fuller than others. Some neighborhoods had easier access. Some families still stretched meals thin. But the arc bends toward structure. From fragile docks dependent on nearby farms, to rail cars crossing states, to refrigerated trucks crossing continents, to container ships crossing oceans, to algorithms dispatching dinner in minutes, New York learned how to feed millions. Not perfectly, but persistently. If you listen carefully, the sounds haven't changed as much as you might think. In 1820, the scrape of a knife on bread crust. In 1890, the pop of a pickle barrel lid. In 1930, the soft ladle of soup into tin bowls. In 1950, the hum of a refrigerator. In 2025, the buzz of a phone announcing delivery. Different technologies, same purpose. Sustain the body. Gather the family. Continue the work. Build the city. Because the truth is simple. Skyscrapers are built by hands. Hands are powered by meals. Meals come from systems. Systems come from collective effort. New York did not rise on extravagance. It rose on bread. On potatoes, on beans, on milk that slowly became safe, on ice that preserved leftovers, on canned goods that lasted winter, on supermarket aisles that expanded choice, on immigrant recipes carried across oceans, on delivery workers weaving through traffic today. 200 years of kitchens, 200 years of adaptation, 200 years of asking, will there be enough tomorrow? And more often than not, finding a way to answer, yes, not abundance for all, not perfection, but enough. And sometimes, enough is what builds the world. And good night.